My name is J.C. McCauley, and you're watching AccessTV.org.
Good evening. My name is Regina Roundtree, and you're watching W4 News. Tonight, we are at Central Connecticut State University, getting ready to go into a book discussion with the newest release from Professor Leah Wright Rigger. She is a professor at Harvard University and has also written her latest book, The Loneliness of the Black Republican. Before we get started, though, I wanted to take a moment to speak with a few of our guests, get some feeling for what they have that's going on in politics, and their take on the book. So, Sweets, tell me, Sweets, or tell our audience, what are your thoughts as a Black Republican on what's happening now in politics?
Well, I'm very hopeful. I believe with the current administration that a lot of people are looking at politics in a different light, and we'll look at the issues of what each party stands for and see if it's working for them, and then we'll be able to choose appropriately.
Aaron, what's your thoughts?
We are in an era of a new world order that is taking shape. We have got to remember that that government is for and about the people. And that's what's been missing in the last few years. And what I would love to see is the Republican Party take that back, become again a party that is focused on what the people need, the individual. That will bring balance to the direction that we're trying to head in.
So you're here tonight to listen to the professor talk about her book. I don't know if you've had a chance to get the book yet and read it, but it talks a lot about history. So do you know anything about history of Black Republicans and our role in the civil rights movement?
I mean, well, I remember that the Republicans were the first, after slavery was abolished, to register African Americans and allow them the ability to vote. And if memory still serves me correctly, that the southern states seem to be heavily Republicans. I think the differences comes when you get to the north, that it's not that much of a red state up here. And so the rest, I would encourage people to read the book, because it helps dispel a lot of the myths and some of the spin that people put on the truth. And then here you have the actual hard, cold facts. And then you will see that it is really the better party for everyone.
I did have a chance to read through the book, and it is a fitting reminder that we were the party of Lincoln, that is where we began as a political group. So many, even from the South, registered as Republicans when they first started voting. But as time went on, we learned that sometimes it doesn't matter what the color of your skin is, because there still is some disconnect in how the world sees things and how we're represented. And at the same time, where they wanted to do the right thing, it was still hard for them to do it. And in some places, sometimes it seemed impossible for them to do it, no matter what they put in place to follow that answer. One of the key quotes that is always said, you can't, play on both sides at the same time. You're going for this group, the African American group, and you're going for the non-African American group at the same time, and thinking that you're going to make it happen that way. It won't work that way. You've got to,
But with that said, though, looking at history now, this is the 21st century. It comes to the point now, we don't need someone to guide us along the way. We have blueprints, we have the roadmap. So we need to come together as a people of color ourselves and you don't have to hold the party responsible, but if you're registered as a Republican, then you create that Black Republican Party to fit our agenda and move the issues along that is for us. Why are we asking someone else to do for us that we're not going to do for ourselves? And that's where I stand with that. So to me, it's like African Americans have an opportunity, or people of color have an opportunity at this point, because the country is changing, to vacate the myths and all of the traditions that we've followed for all these years. If it's not working for you, come and join us and then help us to make it work for us. We have to do it for ourselves.
Good. Very good. So we're going to take a break. This is Regina Roundtree, and you're watching W4 News.
How do you judge a law firm's success? Cases won, money made, or what the firm does in the community? At Dressler Strickland, we know that success is just the beginning. The true measure of success is what you do with it. For 33 years, we've used our success to help our neighbors and our community. 24/7, 11/22. Whenever you need us, we'll be there. Dressler Strickland, building communities one case at a time.
Connecticut Gospel, in association with Trinity on Main, presents a spring 2015 gospel blockbuster featuring Jay Caldwell and the Gospel Ambassadors from Wilmington, Delaware. Sunday, May 3rd, doors open at 3 o'clock p.m. at the First Lutheran Church of the Reformation, 77 Franklin Square, New Britain. Also appearing the group Fire, the Brothers That Love the Lord, and the Kergama Community Choir, 860-890-5571.
Well, good evening, everyone. Good evening. Good evening. I'm glad you guys could all come out tonight. My name is Brian Pryor. I am the president of Young Americans for Liberty here at Central Connecticut State University. I'm glad you all will be able to find the room all right. So tonight it is my very esteemed pleasure to be introducing our moderator and our speaker. Our moderator tonight, Ms. Regina Roundtree, is the president and CEO of the Civil Rights Institute here in Hartford. Her personal mission is to help people connect and communicate in a way that is authentic, informative, and beneficial for all people involved. She is currently the president and CEO for 3 organizations, and just a couple things that she's done. She was the chair of the Urban Affairs Coalition for the Connecticut Republican Party. She was the president and CEO at the Civil Rights Institute. She founded that, I believe, correct? And she was the urban affairs coordinator for Tom Foley for governor this last election cycle. So let's give her a big round of applause. All right, without further ado, I'd love to introduce our speaker who came all the way down from Harvard. Hope you found the place all right. Miss Leah Wright Rigger is an assistant professor of public policy at Harvard Kennedy School. Before joining the Kennedy School faculty, Leah was a professor at Wesleyan University in Connecticut. She received her BA in history from Dartmouth College and her master's and PhD in history from Princeton University. Her book tonight that we'll be discussing is The Lowliness of the Black Republican, Pragmatic Politics and the Pursuit of Power. This book covers more than 4 decades of the American political and social history and examines the ideas and actions of Black Republican activists officials, and politicians from the era of the New Deal to Ronald Reagan's presidential ascent in 1980. Her work provides a new understanding of the interaction between African Americans and the Republican Party and the seemingly incongruous intersection of civil rights and American conservatism. Ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Ms. Rigueur and Ms. Roundtree.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. So thank you all for making it out. I'm very excited to have you out here tonight. And I'm most excited about having Professor Wright here, Rigueur, to talk about her book and to talk about everything about the history of writing the book, what it's been like after having it published. And so the format for this evening will be that we'll go through a few questions and answers with her for about 40 minutes. And then there will be an opportunity for questions from the audience. And so when it's time, I'll motion, and there's a mic over here to my left. And you can come down and ask any questions, just about any questions that you would like. All right? So let's get started. And it's awkward because we have to pass the mic back and forth, but the lapel mics did not work. So I apologize for that. So let's start with, I think what everybody wants to know is what made you write this book? And as a matter of fact, I saw your thesis, and I had pulled pieces of it from Wesley, and I think I found it about a year, half ago. And I was reading it over and over, sending it to everybody that I knew when I found it. I thought it was great. And it helped give kind of context to this sense that myself as a Black Republican feeling like there was no history, there was nothing to kind of pull from. It seemed like you had to make up things as you were going along, or you could only go as far back as maybe, Condoleezza Rice or Colin Powell. Like, it seemed there was no substantial history for us. And so I appreciate that, but tell us how and why you decided to do this particular book.
Okay, so before I give that answer, I just want to say thank you to everyone for coming out. I see a lot of familiar faces. And so I would really just encourage you to, a lot of you have heard different aspects of this story. For many of you, though, it might be the first time you actually have heard me talk about this book in a professional setting. So I would encourage you to carry over the conversations that we've had at home or at various events and houses and ask me those questions about the book. And I know several of you have raging questions and debates. So please, by all means, bring those up. And thank you to Regina for bringing me here and arranging this whole thing. So it's great to be here. So how did I get started with the book? I should say my interest has always been in politics and history. I'm a historian by training. And I was really interested in doing contemporary history. I sometimes play around with being a political scientist, but I'm not actually a political scientist, but I like contemporary things. And I was really interested in doing something on Jesse Jackson and the Rainbow Coalition as a political movement. So the rise really of Jesse Jackson in 84 and 88 to how we get to Jesse Jackson today, who doesn't have an MSNBC show, but is still active in political circles. And then somebody came out with that book. And, in my field, if somebody has come out with the book and has written the book and has written a good book, then really you go back to start. But I did find a really interesting document, and it was Jesse Jackson speaking to the Republican National Committee in 1978. And it felt completely at odds with what I knew about politics. Why would Jesse Jackson, a very liberal civil rights activist with very close Democratic Party ties, be speaking to the Republican National Committee? It just didn't make sense to me. So I did a little more research, and I couldn't find anything. And that's the kind of thing that makes a really good project, when you can't find anything, and then you have to focus in and hone in on and do the work yourself. And after speaking with a couple people, they told me, go big. And they said, go big because you're not going to find anything. So why not go as huge as possible? And in fact, the reverse was true. I found thousands of documents. Currently, I'm about 23,000 documents and still growing on African Americans and their relationship to the Republican Party, from activists, intellectuals, politicians, officials, things like that, and how they really struggle with the party over the course of almost 50 years. So that's how I got started.
So why did you choose to start with the 1930s? Why not the 1900s or the 1800s, 1950? Why did you start? Why did your timeline begin there?
So 1936 is a huge moment, watershed moment, not only in Black politics, but in American politics in general. And so just a quick history lesson. 1936 is the aftermath of the New Deal. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt has been in office now, has kind of really cemented his place as a presidential figure, as a democratic figure who has had an impact on the country, a nation that is in the throes of depression. And that's the year that we see a massive shift in Black voting activity. Massive, just this huge rearranging of the electorate, the body electorate. And so any good study, any good historical and political study of African Americans and politics in the political system has to start in 1936. And sure, I could have, I think, gone back further, but maybe that's another book.
And tell us about the places that you went to actually gather these documents. Because I remember reading an article, I don't know which news outlet did it on you, and you talked about your travels to all the libraries. Tell us about that.
So I definitely have a show that's waiting to be made called Adventures in the Archives. Anybody want to sponsor that? By all means, do so. But I went all over the country. So I went to the Rockefeller Archives. I went to the Reagan Archives. I went to the Lyndon B. Johnson Archives. I went to the Ford Archives. Michigan, Texas, Tennessee, Florida, Arizona, California. I was all over the place for roughly 2 years. And I have to say, part of this was because I had fantastic funding, and public funding is important. Sorry, that's a little jab there, but I think it was exciting to go to these very different places because, one, nobody had gone through these archival sources, right? So nobody really thinks to go to the Reagan archives and look for Black people, because the assumption is that there aren't going to be any Black people in the Ronald Reagan archives, or to go to the Barry Goldwater archives and look through these various documents. And, I found just the most amazing things. I think it was definitely a story of struggle. It's one a lot of people might describe as tragedy, but it was really exciting to me as a historian and somebody who's interested in policy and politics. And, I'll just give you one example. I went to the Bush Archives, which, I mentioned the story, Adventures in the Archives. George H.W. Bush, up until recently, every year parachutes out of an airplane into the archives in College Station as kind of this adventure-seeking thrill moment. So, but one of the things that I found there is a whole host of documents on civil rights and George Bush's interactions with civil rights. I also found a lot of stuff on Chuck Norris and the Chuck Norris and his classified information on behalf of the Bush administration during the 1980s and 1990s. So it's always an adventure wherever I go. Yeah.
When you started on the journey were you always thinking that you were going to do a book? Or was it just going to stop with the paper that you needed to do for school?
So no, the intent was always a book. What does the book look like? I'm not, at the beginning, no one really knows. And in fact, I thought that the book would be roughly 1936 to 1996. But that's actually book 2. But yes, the intent was always a book, always kind of on that path. Yeah.
Who were the modern day people that helped you? So were you able to find help at all? Were any knowledgeable people within the Republican Party present day, or was it really just you and the librarians that helped you?
So I think this is an opportunity for me to talk really about the interviews that I did. I conducted a lot of in-person interviews, phone interviews with members of the Republican Party, former members of the Republican Party, Democrats who were active during the period. And the one that really stands out to me is Ed Brooke. So Brooke, who recently died, he died in January of this year, gave me a very long, lengthy interview. He also opened up his personal archive to me and his archive in Washington, D.C. And I think that was really invaluable in sketching a story about what was Republican activity like and how has it changed past and present. The other person I think who was instrumental, two other people, Clarence Towns, who was very active in Republican politics in the 1960s, and then Bill Brock, who some of you may be familiar with, but was a member of Reagan's cabinet, was also a senator, was head of the Republican National Committee in the 1970s. He also gave me a very kind of shocking interview, lots of gems in that really helped guide the book.
It's interesting that you bring him up because I love the chapter, The Time of the Black Elephant. And I was going to start at the beginning of the book and go backwards, but since you brought him up and he's towards the end, so let's kind of talk about that. When you're reading the book during the 1970s, one of the things that I really appreciated also as a Black Republican reading the book, besides just that there was a book talking about us, but the documentation of the party consistently saying that we need to reach out to the African American population. And we say that now. And so I'm like, wow, it's like 50, 60 years. You guys have been saying this, and we still have not been able to manage that. But I got the feeling that under Bill Brock, that there was a surge that I don't think we've seen now, and probably was the highest point then, in the commitment that he got as far as funding, the commitment that he had as far as really saying that all Republicans needed to do this, and he was making it just in a national campaign. Talk about that if you can.
Sure. So to give you guys a little bit of context, Bill Brock is head of the Republican Party essentially in the late 1970s. And he comes at a point in time when the Republican Party is just a mess. It is fundamentally a disaster. Gerald Ford has lost the presidency. The party says we don't really know, what to do. We're not doing well with white voters. We're not doing well with Black voters, Latino voters, Asian voters. And he pours in about over $2 million, which in 1978 is a lot of money, but pours over $2 million into outreach efforts towards minorities, but also mandates that Republicans on the national level, on the local level, on the state level have to take initiative to bring minorities into the party. So that's a radical departure, not only from Republican politics, but also from the way that the GOP has traditionally done things up until this point. And then he hires a Black Republican consulting firm to help him do this. Now, nationally, they're not what I would call successful, right? Ronald Reagan doesn't do great amongst Black voters. But locally, the consulting firm and Brock actually do shift how Black voters perceive the Republican Party, at least at this point in time. So I think it's an interesting development, historical development that also has ramifications for contemporary politics.
There's a section in here, I've highlighted a lot, but there's a section in here that I want to talk about because, but I think that every Republican, every Democrat should read this book. Simply, and she didn't pay me to say that, that because of the history, just understanding the struggle. Because I know when I've talked to Republicans within the party, they always go back to, well, we're the party of Lincoln. and kind of this pushback or denial that there was actual real racism within the party. And, you know, they'll give the context of, well, it's the KKK that came from the Democrats and not us. But in this book, you can see the, some of it is overt, some of it is subvertive in the pushback between the white Republicans and Black Republicans. But the thing that interests me is I saw this word colorblind, and I don't think I saw it anywhere else. If I missed it in the book, I apologize. But in this particular passage, and I want to take a moment just to read this. So at this point, Bill Brock has taken over, and they're working on trying to do this outreach. And it says, so when the JCPS argued that traditional civil rights questions have given way to economic issues in 1978, the Black Center did not mean that race was irrelevant, but rather than African Americans saw race and class as intertwined. Nevertheless, white Republicans were eager to read the shift from civil rights to economics through the lens of colorblindness, because it allowed them to focus on economics and the Black middle class without explicitly talking about race. Some Republican politicians like Bob Dole formulated new ideas solely designed to appeal to African Americans who identified themselves to pollsters as conservatives. While the party would never attract the majority of Black electorate by adopting this approach, strategists observed that the party did not need a majority of Black votes in order to win presidential elections. And it goes on, but that really stuck out to me because I think that's the nuanced piece within the party is how do we talk about our issues and not talk about race?
Right. So that is, I mean, this is part of this idea of color blindness, right? So that the Republican Party can push this idea of color blindness. And in fact, I would actually venture to say right now in 2015, this idea of color blindness is not one that is solely attached to conservatism. It's one that's intertwined with liberalism, right? So this idea that we don't see race, therefore is not an issue. Right? So I think part of the problem, though, is that when you think about minority voters and minority activists or whatever you want to call them, they see race and they experience race on their day to day. So to say, I don't see your race, even as race is influencing all of the decisions that are going on, you know, institutionally, individually, things like that, feels a lot like a smack in the face. So trying to balance this idea of color blindness with the reality of being race conscious is one that most people cannot do.
When we talk about that and race, and I'm sure there's a lot of material that you didn't get to put in the book, anything particular that you really see the struggle of the party trying to comprehend how to have this discussion about race and Black Republicans really pushing them on it?
So one thing that immediately jumps out to mind is in 1964, some of you may be familiar with this, the Barry Goldwater runs for president. It's also the same year that the 1964 Civil Rights Act is passed. And he is just decimated in the presidential election. Lyndon Johnson destroys him, with the exception of the Deep South states. And one of the things that the Republican Party takes away from that kind of horrific election is we can't talk about race. Right? This is the thing in their mind. They say we cannot explicitly talk about race. And so they bring up this idea of color blindness, but in their kind of rush to distance themselves from talking about race, they then take on this mantle of, we're not going to talk about race at all. We're going to talk about individualism. We are not going to look at race as this kind of broad category. And I think this is one of these moments where Black Republicans are pushing back and saying, no, it's not that you can't talk about race. You can't talk about race in a racist way. Like that is the kind of the thing. And so they're looking at the 1964 Civil Rights Act and they're saying the problem is that when you're talking about race, you're using it as an antagonism. And this is one of the things that I say in the conclusion, that the Republican Party can talk about race, but they can't do it in an antagonistic way, right? So it can't always be about, when you're having discussions about minorities, kind of the needle in the stomach.
I also remember when we talk about Barry Goldwater, and that seemed to be interesting, right? So we had the Civil Rights Act, then we had the Voting Rights Act, and the country could see, right, that this huge shift. And so many people, many Black people, when you go back and you look at that history, or even I've talked to people today, are amazed at how the Civil Rights Act actually passed, right? And that it was kind of America acknowledging publicly, really for the first time, right, that Blacks had been discriminated against, right, as far as just like a federal national statement. And you would think that with that, and Barry Goldwater losing, that the Republican Party would say, okay, if we want to win, there's some things that we really have to change. And I don't know, maybe you could speak to, as you're reading texts and as you're reading newspaper articles about that time, if you could share with us kind of the sense of the community and the party really on what happened to them when Goldwater lost.
So it's a moment of both, profound disappointment, but also a moment of opportunity. And I think it's a real window, right? After, and this is true really of any political election, after abysmal failures, there's always going to be opportunity for people to come and jump in and explore, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, but in that particular moment, the party is in an identity crisis. It doesn't know who it represents. It doesn't know what it represents. And I think the same is actually true of right now, which is that the party still doesn't know who it represents, what it represents, why it represents what it does. And so ultimately what ends up happening, at least in the 1960s, is that there's a real battle for the soul of the Republican Party. So we see the rise of moderate republicanism, which happens in the mid-1960s as people like Ed Brooke are starting to gain prominence and who play a prominent role in the Senate. But then we also see the rise of right-wing Republicans who come in and say, this is a particular way of doing things. This is what we believe. And really through the 1980s, it's just a constant back and forth and back and forth.
Did you find that when you were researching about the right wing starting to really come of its own, what was the sense from Black Republicans about that? Those that had been there and kind of see this rising up, this kind of tidal wave, and trying to figure out how they were going to now find a place within the party, because there is this sense from the far right wing of the party that they were fine with traditional, like, let's just focus on retaining the white middle class, the white working, residents of this community of the United States. And if we get back to focusing on that, then maybe the party can win again. And so can you share with us kind of what the sense or the feeling is from Black Republicans really starting to see this rise?
So I think one thing I want to clarify is that there are a whole host of, and I talk about this in the book, there are a whole host of different kinds of Black Republicans who really span the spectrum of ideological beliefs. So you do have some who, say, for example, like Jay Parker, who is Clarence Thomas's mentor, who say, I align myself with Barry Goldwater. I believe in this kind of traditional conservatism. But then you have other forces like Ed Brooke, for example, who say this is pseudo-conservatism, this isn't real conservatism, and are really jockeying for power within this party, for a leadership role, and saying we need to pull back, we need to move more to the center if we are going to govern and move forward as a party.
You take up a whole chapter talking about Nixon, and then afterwards you call it the ghost of Nixon. Explain the ghost of Nixon, and then we'll talk about Nixon.
Well, I think for anybody who is familiar with American political history, you know that Richard Nixon does a number on the country, right? Both, I mean, positively, there are a lot of things that he does that he doesn't necessarily get credit for, including moving forward affirmative action for whatever his intent is. But then he also kind of, I think, really does a number on the Republican Party after the Watergate scandal. And as things start to really come out about the excesses of corruption and the increase in presidential power and in imperial power, there's a fundamental distrust not only of the Republican Party, but of government in general, right? So after Richard Nixon leaves office, if you poll your average American on the street, they say government is not to be trusted. The office of the president is not to be trusted. Politicians are crooks, right? In fact, it's really actually not too different from how people perceive politicians today, right? Congress is at its lowest approval rating. So I think we see that. And for Black Republicans, Richard Nixon is at first an opportunity. You know, they're like, oh my God, we have a Republican president who really is kind of a moderate in office, who is putting us in positions of power and saying, hey, you guys, make policy, enact policy. And this is where the Philadelphia Plan and affirmative action come from. At the same time, he is stymieing every single thing that they do. So he's smiling with one hand and he's slapping him in the face with the other. And so there's a frustration there. And as they move forward into the mid-1970s under the weight of Watergate, they really just don't know how to recover. Because not only are they dealing with the excesses of a president, a vindictive president, right, who goes after his enemies and has made life living hell for African Americans, and this perception that he's made life living hell for them, they're also dealing with this idea that politicians can't be trusted and Republicans can't be trusted. So they do a lot of work and they do a lot of legwork in terms of organizing in order to move past that memory, right? So they put a lot of faith in Gerald Ford, perhaps wrongly.
I did see, when you talk about Nixon, could you talk some more about the Black cabinet, that he put together, how he picked that? And what kind of hurt my heart is when I was reading it, I got excited, although, I kind of know history. But when I was excited, I'm like, okay, great, because this is the beginning of the book. And so he's going to do this. But I'm saying in the back of my mind, how come nothing works? Because I don't remember, reading or knowing about any of that. And what you say is true, is that as you go along, you find that he stymied them in every way possible. Can you just talk and inform a little bit more about the cabinet and the frustrations and what happened during that time?
So Richard Nixon assembles what I informally call a cabinet of Black policymakers. And it's not necessarily just Black Republicans. He also puts Black Democrats, Black independents in place. He at one point offers Ed Brooke several positions, including talking about maybe appointing him to the Supreme Court, which you guys know that would be huge, right? But at the same time, and they're able to draft policy and have influence over policy, especially economic policy. Black capitalism is a program that comes out of this. Affirmative action comes out of this. Education funding for HBCUs. In fact, the pipeline for African Americans to work into the federal government comes out of the Nixon administration. But I think there's also this, I'm going to call it double consciousness of being Black and working for a Republican president, where the assumption is there's a lot of discussion of sellout, being a traitor to your race, especially in heated political moments. So as I said before, on the one hand, Nixon would do all of these things and say, I don't want to publicize these civil rights gains that we're making. But on the other hand, would do kind of horrific things to dismantle and really talk about, and even rhetorically talk about some of these policy things on busing, on affirmative action that pissed people off. right? So by the end of his first term, his popularity ratings amongst African Americans are in the toilet. And so what the officials, the cabinet that are working in his administration are facing is that on the one hand, they're really working for these policy preferences and initiatives. On the other hand, they are facing backlash from their communities.
And we're about to break and take some questions from the audience, but I wanted to ask you, is there a figure, is there someone who really stands out to you that like lingered with you after you read about what they did, their accomplishments or disappointments? So share with us something that or a person who really still stands out to you.
Well, I'll actually say two. I'll cheat. The first one is Art Fletcher, who really is, he's called the watchdog of labor, the godfather of labor, and the godfather of affirmative action, because he comes into the Nixon administration and really pushes for policy, right? And says the next phase of the civil rights movement is an economic phase. And that's actually a push, I think, that we see across political lines, right? So Martin Luther King, when he dies, is saying something very similar. The next push in the civil rights movement is for economic justice and political justice. The second person, I think, is Ed Brooke. And part of that is because of how he disappeared from history. And then with the election of Barack Obama, makes a reemergence. And, I would make the argument that he is Barack Obama before Barack Obama is Barack Obama. And so, I know there's been a lot of things tossed around saying, oh, Barack Obama is a Rockefeller Republican. Barack Obama is a moderate Republican in Democrats' clothing. But I think it's more apt to say that he represents this kind of centrist position, which we now call neoliberalism, but a centrist position that once was at home in the Republican Party. And that is really articulated and comes to light through a figure like Edward Brooke.
So if you have questions, if you'll line up over here, and I will give one more question to Leah. So if you have a question, please come over. Share something that actually took you down a rabbit hole. Like, tell us about a journey, or you found one little piece of nugget of information and you just followed that and followed that. I'm kind of interested in, some intriguing things that happened with really researching.
Well, I think the project in itself is a rabbit hole, right? So I started off with that story about Jesse Jackson, which I think if most people see that, they say it doesn't have legs. Jesse Jackson is an opportunist, or maybe the Republican Party was, acting on opportunity. But instead it opened up this whole world that was completely foreign to me and was foreign to most people.
Thank you again. The discussion has been absolutely fantastic. My quick question would be: how do you think that Republicans can overcome the cultural smear that that if a black person is in the Republican Party, they get such terms as, "Oh, you're just a token," or that all Republicans are racist? I mean, these come up oftentimes, especially from the far left, the neoliberal philosophy. When overwhelmingly, there's obviously people that you've brought up that are obviously prominent Republicans, with people like Thomas Sowell, for instance, that have deep conservative roots. How do you think we overcome that?
So I answered in two parts. The short answer is don't be racist, right? So, part of this is, and I mentioned this before, this is the second part. I mentioned this before during the reception, which is that the Republican Party, in trying to overcome this hurdle, is going to be judged by its worst element. It's going to be judged by the bottom of the bottom. And say what you will, the Democratic Party does not have to overcome that hurdle. And so one of the things that you're really going to need to see is for prominent Republicans to come out and vigorously and aggressively denounce any ounce of racism, right? Implicit, explicit, whatever you want to call it, in the party. The other part of this is that Republicans actually have to listen to people of color, right? So we talked about this during the reception, but actually holding town halls and coming in and saying, I'm a Republican and I just want to hear what you have to say. And so listening and then going back into the drawing board and saying, okay, this is what people are talking about. This is what people are really interested in. How can we take our conservatism, or take our right of center views and mesh this with the actual needs of American citizens.
You have to come over here to the mic. Oh, well, you know what? No, you bring the mic over.
Last few years, the Republican Party has been known as the party of no. No social reforms, no social justice, no social anything. Too bad that there are poor people, and the poor people need to get off their butts, off welfare, and get off the dole. Okay, and these are Republican words I've heard from Republican voices and Republican faces, including senators and whatnot. Response?
I mean, the Republican Party has a long history of being the party of no. In 1960s, this is one of the things that Ed Brooke is writing about. He's like, we are known as the party of no. So it's never that he says, I may not, he says particularly, I may not be a liberal Democrat, but we can't fault them for trying. They always have initiatives. They may be the wrong initiatives, but they always have policy recommendations. They're always trying new things. They're always innovating. Why aren't we doing that? And so one of the things that he calls for is constructive innovation and progressive conservatism, where he says we need to be forward thinking. We need to be thinking of ideas of how to engage people. How do we solve the problems of a nation? And I think that's very much true today, right? So to just be opposed to something is not enough. And in fact, it's probably just going to make people upset. But to come forward and have policy prescriptions, having ideas, talking about the realities that people face, right? That is something that, I think has meat and has merit.
Come up here so we can get you on camera.
Oh, not that. Okay. Party of no and no solutions. 1946, the federal government had about 79 programs and departments. We now have over 796 programs and departments because the government has grown so much. And so no seems appropriate sometimes. And possibly just a redesign might be something that can happen, but it's very hard once something gets put into place to take it down or shrink it or join it to something else. And so there's a lot of duplication actually in the same purpose, the same mission. And so we have an $18 trillion national debt because of a lot of yes. So I think being the party of no is to keep the party going, keep the country going, and having a country that can sustain itself under the weight of the obligations it takes on. So I think there has to be something about that probably in the thinking of people who say no. I wonder what you think about that.
So I think part of what, and I can talk about this from the perspective of how people on the ground are perceiving this. I think if you ask most people, if you ask minority voters, is the government excessive? Is it too big? Does it do too much? They will say yes. Clearly, right? There's because of if you even look at just opinion polls about the amount of unhappiness that there is with Congress or even with the presidency, right? We have a popular president who at the same time, a lot of people are unhappy with. But then when you think about what are people unhappy about, that's where you start to get into some snafus, right? In particular, think about if you poll people and ask them, if you poll minorities about, say, the defense budget, most of them will say it is excessive. Why do we focus so much on defense and why do we focus so much on other countries when we can't even focus on what's going on at home? So I think part of what you're talking about is when do we say no? What do we say no to? And a lot of times perception is reality. So I think, if we had, say, for example, more Republicans or more, even more Democrats standing up and saying, these are excessive programs, but we should be pumping money into these things, these policy preferences that minority communities support, you would see a completely a shift in the conversation.
Hi, how are you?
Hi.
Thank you for coming down. More of a comment. I believe you mentioned earlier that Republicans should talk about race without being racist. Am I correct? All right. Whether we talk about race without being racist, the liberal media is going to turn it into whatever they want to turn it into anyway. So we can talk about race without being racist, but the 6 o'clock report, the MSNBCs of the world, the CNNs are going to turn it into a race issue. How do you overcome that? How do you overcome the liberal media and their perception of us, regardless of what we do?
So I mean, that's a tough call, right? Because we live in an era of the 24-hour news cycle, and I know everyone speaks about the liberal media, but we also live in an era where there is a lot of conservative media as well. I think part of what you begin to do is have conversations around race that don't necessarily take on hot button issues. The other thing I think that you do is have conversations on alternative platforms, right? So social media, for example, is one. Facebook, we talked about this a little bit earlier. Facebook, Twitter, right? Those are areas in which people are engaging much more. I mean, cable news right now is in some respects is on the decline, right? Whereas social media and the aspect of social media is on the uprise. So I think the other thing too is being sensitive to the audience that you're trying to talk to and that you're trying to engage with. I think there is an opening there. And we have seen some Republican politicians who talk about race and who do it in a way that is sensitive, that there's no twisting those words around, right? And that people are intrigued by that. Rand Paul, right? So I know actually he's in the news for not saying he's actually saying a few boneheaded things. But I like to think back to the Howard University incident where he went and it wasn't a great showing. He kind of bungled a lot of things. But then much more recently, especially with the Ferguson protests, he came out and made statements both on policy and on politics that really spoke to a lot of African American preferences and beliefs. And so while I think there's still a gulf between there, the fact that he is actually trying to do the legwork that leads to kind of new relationships, right, and works on building trust is something that people should look to and actually pay attention to. And so I think, the interesting thing to me is that Ferguson and his statements on Ferguson were not spun. He was one of the first politicians to come out and say, the militarization of the police force in local communities is wrong. And so for that kind of a statement, you can't spin it. So thank you. No problem.
Unless we get a special deal tonight at $37, your book is a bargain. Today's book rates, which from academic presses, which leads me to wonder, they think it's going to be a big seller?
They would hope.
Okay. Now, while you're thinking about book 2, taking things up to Baltimore this week, or whatever book 2 will be, I have a fondness for biography. Mm-hmm. And I think maybe while you're thinking about book 2, you could think about doing a biography of Ed Brooke.
Absolutely. That is also on the list of books that I need to write. So I've been playing around with it, and I did have mentioned in several places that I would love to write a political biography of Ed Brooke. He is a singularly fascinating figure who also says a lot about modern politics, American politics, the Republican Party, centrism, moderate republicanism, and how far the political spectrum has changed in the last 50 years.
You got your chapters
Yes, I do. I do. Clear thinking ahead.
The corners, I know you speak. At least you're getting your steps up. Hope you got 10,000 today. Am I good? So I've got a question around what seems to be a lack of inclusivity in terms of current modern day conservative politics. You see the rise of the Tea Party movement and some of these other things that, to be quite honest, don't even seem to really benefit the people who are espousing them in terms of the merits of the policies and what ultimately they mean for people. And when you talk about the party of no, and you talk about Republicans or conservatives changing the script and the dialogue around race and how they view it, can you shed context in terms of why it seems as though there's really almost a deliberate intent to actually exclude people who have a different ethnic background, whether they're Latino or Black, or don't seem to share that same aesthetic?
So there's definitely there's definitely perception that is based in reality, right? Exactly what you're talking about. And I will say that there's definitely a subset, and I'll call them a fringe element, that strongly believes, as say Phyllis Schlafly does, that we need to buckle down and focus on increasing the number of white men that vote for the Republican Party. Everybody else is by the wayside. I think, though, that the vast majority of other people really do believe that they would like to include minorities in this. But I think a lot of it is we want to include minorities, but only on our terms. And so there's this belief that we have to fundamentally change our conservatism and our belief in the individual and in color blindness in order to include racial minorities, right? These other people who don't look like this. And so oftentimes what comes off as principled or constitutionally based things just ends up seeming racist. And so I think one of the things, and I argue this in my book, in the conclusion of my book, is that the Republican Party and strategists within the party, politicians, officials, really need to wrestle with what race means and talking about race means in the context of this idea of principled constitutionality, right? That actually, for the vast majority of people who are of a racial background or an ethnic background, that is part of their identity and that is important to them. So they want it recognized. And I'll just give you a quick stat. Roughly 80% of African Americans believe that the Republican Party does not care about them as a racial group, right? And this includes a subset, about a third, who identify as socially conservative. So that is a fundamental distrust that is based on, right, this kind of rhetoric, even if it is principled or constitutional. The other thing that I'll say is this idea of individualism is really nice in theory, but until people can get their civil rights and their human rights recognized as a racial group, individualism is only going to be a theory for African Americans. So trying to have discussions with African Americans, Latinos, Black people from the Caribbean, Asian Americans is going to be, stunted, because this idea of the individual and individual liberty doesn't resonate with their actual lived experience. Yeah. So hope that answered the question.
Hi.
Hi.
My name's Clement. I had a couple questions. I had like three. Because we mentioned MSNBC and we mentioned news, and I used to be a journalism major, and so I watch news and stuff. How do you feel about Fox News? Because I think everyone in this room can pretty much agree that it's pretty problematic as far as the way they treat or portray, or the rhetoric they use for minorities, African Americans, especially now with things that are going on in Baltimore.
Mm-hmm.
We're seeing a lot of just really bad journalism that's happening. So how do you feel about that?
So journalism in this country has gone down a long, deep, steep, problematic and troubling hole. And I think that we have made the move or the shift from journalism, right? So which was reporting the news, putting it in context, factual based kind of analysis, to opinion based news. I think part of the problem, though, comes in when you have and this doesn't necessarily just work for Fox News, but this is also a huge problem with CNN and at times with MSNBC. But when you have very few people of color in positions of power in the editorial room, in the production room, this is how you end up with major, major problems, right? So referring to, and I mentioned this earlier, referring to Black women who are dressed in blue, who are Zeta Phi Beta, as Crips and gang members. That's not going to fly. That is poor journalism. And right, that was CNN. So this is why I said this is not a problem. This is a problem that goes beyond Fox News. But I come from a school where journalism is a reporting of the facts, putting in context, right? A kind of old school understanding of things and trying to be as objective as possible. So no, I'm not necessarily a fan of this new wave. I'm also not a fan of the 24/7 pundit cycle where everybody weighs in these kind of quick sound bites without any real analysis.
And another question. Because I know a lot of the times when we talk about race in this country, a lot of the times when we talk about like how far Black people have come, how far minorities have come in Black accomplishment, it sort of seems like it, to me, it's like a kind of a slap in the face, because it's like saying, oh, Black people have come so far is like saying that we've deserved the things that we've gotten in the past. So do you think white Republicans are willing to acknowledge their privilege, willing to acknowledge institutionalized racism, that it exists? Because that's another huge issue.
So I like to remain optimistic, and I will say I think that there are. I cannot speak for white Republicans, but what I am impressed by is on an issue like criminal justice reform and prison reform, there has been this fragile coalition, bipartisan coalition, with participation on all, across the political spectrum. And so I think that there are some issues that people can acknowledge that we have a real and significant problem, an institutional problem. That being said, I think that the issues that our country is facing is going to force people to reckon with their privilege and to reckon with race, right? Because we've gone for so long saying, oh, things are fine, things are okay. But when you have something like the uprisings in Ferguson from 2014, or you have the Baltimore in 2015, that forces people to acknowledge that there is a real institutional, systemic problem. And it can't be addressed through, feelings and emotions, but actually deserves a public policy response.
Can you speak to, in the book, what was interesting is that you very clearly documented the agitation between white Republicans and Black Republicans. And I don't think that is acknowledged enough. Like, it's sort of like, okay, you can talk about the party of Lincoln, but let's just start with 1930, right? We don't have to go back that. And it's very clear the disconnect, the agitation, the frustration, like every single administration. And I don't know, maybe I'm just making a statement that get the book and read the book and look at the history, though, of the frustration. It shocked me, because sometimes I guess you want to think that, oh, it's only an issue in year 2000, or it really wasn't that bad. But every single administration, Black Republicans were like just banging their heads against the wall with white Republicans to have these kind of conversations, and they weren't doing it. And so it's not like it's just now that they're having a problem talking about. It's consistent throughout history that there is this, and like I said, I think probably during the time when Brock was in control of at the RNC, that there's probably the greatest move forward. So just, I don't know if you want to.
I'll just say really quickly that I think, yes, that is absolutely true, that there's this constant frustration. And in fact, what we see is that Black Republicans often break the 11th commandment of the GOP. Thou shalt not speak ill of another Republican, right? They are constantly speaking ill of other Republicans and of their own party. And you know the problem is bad when Clarence Thomas, right, who's really a statesman for the Republican Party, in 1987 says, you know, if you're a Black Republican in this day and age, white Republicans expect you to shuck and jive. And we have a real fundamental problem with race. This is Clarence Thomas saying this, right? So, I mean, yes, it is. It's a huge problem. It's absolutely a huge problem. So did you have your...
How do you feel about, because I knew a lot of the things you just were like economic concerns, but about social concerns, because I know the Republican Party is very conservative, very religious, and I know certain like issues like family planning, women's reproduction rights, LGBT issues aren't really at the forefront of any kind of Republican agenda. So how do you feel like that, like how that collides with like the Black community? Because there are Black women who want proper family planning, who LGBT members, so like how does that fit into your...
Well, what I will say is, and I do mention this in the book, about a third of African Americans self-identify as socially conservative, right? And in fact, if you know anything about African Americans, they are of any racial group, they are actually the most religious racial group, right? Like something like 90% religiosity. But that social conservatism does not translate into support for the Republican Party. And I think part of that is because, one, African Americans compartmentalize their conservatism, right? So they may vote for conservative policies on the ballot, right, in Hartford, Connecticut, or in New York City. But then when it comes time to check the ballot box for, you know, a Republican candidate or a Democratic candidate, they're going to check and say Democratic candidate. And in part, a lot of that comes back to the history and kind of this relationship that African Americans in the Democratic Party have had and the Republican Party have had, right? So that there's this fundamental distrust where they say they are not in my best interest. So even if I align with them on all of these policy issues, on racial issues, we are not seeing eye to eye.
Thank you.
My daughter, so.
Come all the way up to the front.
Sure. Thank you. Two questions, actually. One is, in the history of Republican parties, they managed to put a lot of different interests under a tent. Mm. And I'm old enough to remember that there was this massive shift of even labor, Southern labor and unions, over to conservatism. And I always thought it was because once unions became middle class, they didn't have to fight those issues anymore. Why haven't they been able to put Black interests under the same tent? I mean, I think it's been disingenuous, but why haven't they been able to do that?
That's the $1 million question. Right. So in the 1960s, Republican strategists say, look, Democrats were able to align labor, African Americans, moneyed interest, all of these things. Why can't we do the same? Why can't we have a Ku Klux Klan member in the party at the same time that we have a Black person in the party? And I think some of this comes down to, economics. Wherein if you poll African Americans in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, they say that the Democratic Party is the party of the working man. The other thing is that they are able to, the Democratic Party is really, African Americans are really able to make significant civil rights gains through the Democratic Party through the 1980s. And so because they were able to make those gains, there is a lot of activity. It's where most of the action has happened. It's where most of, this is where most of these things. Does that answer your question?
Kind of, yeah.
Kind of, sort of.
And then the other part of this question is, the Republican Party was always known when I was growing up as the party of the wealthy. Mm-hmm. Lawyers, bankers, doctors, that was the group. And they could have conversations at the corner store with working class people, and everybody just understood the separation. Why hasn't the black middle to upper class migrated to that comfortable place where, you're perceived as the rich go? Why doesn't that materialize?
So interesting enough, the black 1%, so the wealthiest of African Americans, have migrated over there. Right? So this is why we see black athletes, black celebrities saying, I identify with the Republican Party. In terms of, the interesting part of this is once we drop down below the top 1%, the black middle class and the black wealthy, the wealthier they are and the more educated they are, the more likely they are to vote Democrat. So the more liberal they become. And I think part of that is because as you move forward, you become more educated about racial issues, about the context of racial issues. I also think there's an experience that can make African Americans even more liberal when they go to integrated schools. So the educational experience, right? So if you grow up in a segregated community and you only see other African Americans, or you only see other Latinos, we see actually much more political diversity there. But once you see have an experience of going to an educational experience where you're the only minority, you're the only person, and you're constantly faced with these microaggressions, with battles and things like that, that actually increases your liberal outlook, your liberal ideology. So I think this is part of why we see that. The other fundamental problem, and I'll just throw this out here, is that we don't necessarily have any great data for why Black people vote the way they do and why they ideologically believe the things that they do. We can say anecdotally or sociologically that it's because of their racial experience in America, but there's actually very few people who have gone out and done polling and say, why do you vote for this Democrat? Why, those 12% of you who are voting for Republicans, why do you vote for Republicans? So, and part of that is because there's an assumption that all African Americans are liberal and all African Americans will support the Democratic Party.
Back again.
Welcome.
So I just wanted, in my introduction, I forgot to mention that we are selling your book tonight. That was important. Big flaws as the introduction person. I apologize. My other question would be, do you think in the next, I'm about to be graduating myself. I'm seeing in politics today, however, especially among the youth, a really big turning. Mm-hmm. This critical, big lever that's being pushed, where people of my generation, as we spoke about earlier in the other room, they don't want to identify with labels. They feel like they're just a lot of baggage that comes along with them, and that they want to shrug that off and say, I'm my own person, and I'm a big individualist on my philosophy side. So that's plug in there. My question would be, where do you see this going in the next 20 years? Do you see that this status quo is changing, that we're actually going to be having a broader outreach to people, for instance, as we mentioned earlier, the Latino community, the Asian American community, the Black American community? What do you think is going to happen in that sense?
So there's what do I think is going to happen versus what actually will happen, or what should happen, right? And one of the things that I would hope is that the Republican Party would recognize, and I think there are a couple of major strategists who do recognize this, that statistically, numerically, it is impossible to ignore people of color. You cannot, going forward, the country demographically is changing. And so you cannot rely on this coalition of random assortments of white people to put you in office. It would take a tremendous amount of solely, white voters in order to do that. And so I know there's been some focus on, voter ID laws and, let's get less, people of color to come out and vote and things like that. But you do have some very important people who are saying, hey, actually, we need to figure out how we can get 15% of black voters, 30% of Latino voters, 40% of Asian voters. They haven't quite figured out how to do it, but I would hope that in the future we do see that. The other side of this, though, is I do think to some extent you're right that young people, and in fact, I think historically young people have been like this, where they resist labels, right? They say, we are a new generation and we don't want to be thought of as this way or this way. But remaining or being an independent doesn't necessarily divorce you from the political process. And so I think any politician, this is actually the brilliance of Barack Obama, that he was able in 2008 to mobilize college students to the extent that he did. So I think any political party going forward, any candidate going forward has to mobilize young people and in fact appeal to this idea of, I'm different, I'm a different kind of politician, I am not the politics of old, right? And in fact, that's one of the things that Barack Obama did in 2008, where he said, hope and change, right? I am not the same kind of politician that you are used to dealing with. And he made people feel like they could be part of a changing America. Right?
Well, then I'll be out here. Great. So
you want to have a seat?
Hey, if you got one with the back, I don't do stools. But so I've got a couple of things, questions, but it's multi-layered. So a lot of what I hear is just kind of this notion that a lot of the beliefs, even when you say that Republicans today, the more progressive ones will say we need to plug disproportion of blacks and so forth, across the racial spectrum, that feels like a view of the other. So there's this predicated view of we're over here in this real America, but we need to bring some of these people, to the question earlier, under the tent with us in order to substantiate our numbers. But then you have these other macro forces, structural forces around mass incarceration, population growth among the Latino community that's outpaced the population growth in the black community, so that blacks are actually a smaller proportion of the total than we were just 10 years ago. And, so when you think about that, how relevant actually do you see black Republicans being, knowing that you've got these super PACs who are investing in candidates that they say, this person's going to represent my interest, and they really don't have to think about black voters or black Americans, truth be told, at all.
Except that they do. Right. So even as African, I'll just answer the latter part of that. Even as African Americans are kind of diminishing in percentage wise, they still put Barack Obama over the edge in 2012. Right. So everyone thought it was going to be Latinos. And in fact, Latinos are this huge group. And it was actually black Americans. And so one of the things that Hillary forces, I think, are thinking about in 2016 is how do we get black people, in particular black men, because black women have always come out to vote, but how do we get black men to come out to vote in the same numbers that they've come out to vote for Barack Obama? Right. Well, this is why we have prison reform, right? And why there should be a lot of work around disenfranchisement and allowing former prisoners to vote. I think the other part of this is that there is and I think this is what you kind of touched about. There's a natural allegiance along certain lines that I think can lead to significant changes. So even as African Americans, percentage-wise, are becoming not as big as part of the voting body electorate, they still have a tremendous amount of power and say and voice. And I don't necessarily think that it is only in the form of electoral politics. I think we're seeing this in Baltimore right now, right? People on the ground who are quote unquote rioting or uprising and whatever you want to call it are actually making a statement about policy preferences, institutionalized racism, and change that the nation is going to be forced to respond to. The last thing that I'll say about this is that even as, these things are changing, we still do have people who are in positions of power within administrations, who are designing policy, who are sitting on the Supreme Court, who are sitting on federal courts, who are sitting on, like state appeals, things like that. Local politics is going to play a huge role. So in areas that are disproportionately black, the people that we elect, the politicians that represent us, this is where we're going to see real power plays happening. All politics is local politics. And so I think that's where we can say not only black Republicans, but Black politicians in general still like continue to matter and continue to make a difference.
So
it looks like there's one last.
I just have one last question. Okay, earlier I brought up. Earlier, I brought up that Republicans were the party of no. The response was, it's because we can't afford it. We can't afford these policies. However, I've been quite aware of the fact that the last time we were not in the red, the economy was not in the red, was when we had an excess as with a Democratic president. And ever since then, we've been going downhill. Obama has had to deal with what was left him, the rags that were left him to try to pull together to make one piece, a good nation.
Is it a comment or a question? Or
I'd like you to address that. Speak to it.
I mean, that's a tough. I mean, that's a tough one because I think yes, Obama was left kind of to pick up the pieces. At the same time, I think even as we look at the Obama administration, we do have to acknowledge that he has made choices that haven't necessarily been to the best of, say, African American interests, right? Or even how he identifies. And this is earlier why I said, there's been a lot of reference tossing around the idea of Obama as a Rockefeller Republican. And I think this is in part because he governs from a centrist Democrat position or even a conservative Democrat position. So I think part of this is, this is a ginormous question that is more about the annals of history than it is necessarily about a particular moment. And I'm happy to talk about this more later on. It looks like
Slightly light sounding, but in fact tied to what you said a couple of minutes ago. There is panic in some things that's reported in the papers because black youth are not playing baseball. Now, blacks own professional basketball, except we're importing people from Eastern Europe. You're getting these 7'2" guys with names like Axel Rabadov. However, there's real panic in that there aren't enough black youth playing baseball because they're being swamped by Caribbeans, Colombianos and Dominicanos. Now, is that related to what you referred to earlier in some worry that black percentage of the population is not growing as fast as Latino or whatnot? Is there some economic thing behind that? Is it simply baseball guys wanting more billions of dollars? What might be this fear that black youth aren't playing baseball?
Well, I think part of what you're talking about actually goes back to resources and goes back to experience. So I'm thinking of the Jackie Robinson West, who I think many of you have heard of, right? And they just were stripped of their World Little League title a couple of months ago. And one of the things that went into that is that Jackie Robinson West was assembled from a disparate group of kids black children who wanted to play baseball, but because of club rules and because of their organization and because of the way that districting had happened, couldn't be assembled to play on one particular team, right? So first we have the kind of the level of they're not living in the suburbs, they're living in urban areas, so they don't just have the resources for a baseball team. But then also they're kind of disparate. One kid on Jackie Robinson West was homeless. So what is he supposed to do? And I think part of what they did was they assembled a team and then they were disqualified because their definition of team didn't fit Little League's rules. And so I think when we begin to think about that, we can start to think about why African Americans are not playing baseball. We can also look at something like, it's not just baseball. They're not playing hockey. They've never played hockey, right? They're not necessarily playing soccer in the same levels that they're playing basketball or football. And a lot of it has to do with environment, has to do with geography, and it has to do with experience. So how are people pulling in? The other thing I think when you think about, it's also a story of economics, right? So what do you have access to? So it's not enough in today's day and age to just play baseball. You have to pay for AAU teams. You have to pay for special coaching. You have to pay for special training. You have to pay for summer camps. And these are things often that, if we're talking about, lower middle class and poor working class African American children, they just don't have the resources to do those things. So I think if we look at kind of economics, if we look at geography, and if we look at an urban story, it tells a very different narrative about why African American youth are involved in sport or not.
To also comment on that, just think about the rise of charter and magnet schools. And so as those come into play in communities, oftentimes kids are pulled from their home community to go to school at a charter or magnet that, one, touts being open till 6 or 7 o'clock at night, which is great for the family, but they don't have sports. And so as we kind of push for charter magnet as a better choice for African American youth, for youth in the urban community, you also have to realize that that takes them away from, one, their community, two, if they have to go to a school outside of their district, but that school may have a sports team, but they have to catch the bus to go back home to their own, where they live in the community. So that has become a big disincentive. And when people start looking at communities where kids have been bused, where charter and magnets are taking on this rise, which they say is good, but it's also hurting all the recreational things that one would do if you went to a community school. This has been great. And I think I could ask you like 5 more questions, but I won't. Any last thoughts, things you want to say that someone didn't ask you that you thought was important? And then we'll wrap up.
Any last thoughts? I mean, that's huge. One thing I do want to end on is that I teach a class at the Kennedy School. I also taught it at Wesleyan on race, riot, and backlash in the United States. And it's been an interesting experience because as I am teaching the class, it's going from history to actual living experience. It is happening in this country. And I think as we watch what's going on in Baltimore right now in real time, it's a question that crosses partisan lines. It's a question of, how do we resolve the situation that gave birth to something like Baltimore? And it's not something that's just about, say, economics, but it's also something that's about justice. And so I think having conversations, and I'm really heartened by the fact that there is bipartisan discussion of criminal justice reform, but I would love to see much more conversation on both sides of the aisle about police reform and about challenging standards of institutionalized racism and discrimination that are perpetuated and continue over and over in these urban communities of color. So again, that's a question that holds no political ties, that should be one that every group and every political organization is discussing and coming up with solutions and policy to really address that. All right? Yeah, so thank you guys for all coming out.
If you've not bought the book, you can go right over there if you have your book.